We're at the end of the second healthcare revolution, illustrated on the slide. The first healthcare revolution wasn't really based in science, it was based in empiricism. Namely, John Snow worked out that it was something in the water. Richard Doll, when he looked out on Gower Street, worked out it might be something in the internal combustion engine or something in cigarette smoking, but they didn't actually have the science cracked, the basic science. But the second healthcare revolution, illustrated by the developments you can see on the slide, has transformed the health of populations. And the reason I'm not with you is that I've just benefited from the second healthcare revolution. I had chest pain at 11 o'clock Thursday night, and a stent in by 2 o'clock on Friday morning. Fantastic. But, as the next slide shows, at the end of the second healthcare revolution, every society on earth faces these 5 problems. Failure to prevent preventable disease, harm to patients, inequity, waste of resources, and unwanted variation in almost everything you look at. Activity, quality, and outcome. If we look ahead, we see 4 new challenges. Rising need and demand, no more money, and the need for a lot less carbon. Now, I found it helpful to think of the health service as being able to be expressed by a single word, a single paradigm. From 1948 to about 1970, that word was free. That was all that mattered. From 1970 on, thanks to the influence of Archie Cochrane, we entered the era of effectiveness, which became evidence-based medicine. In the 1990s, we started thinking much more about cost effectiveness. And in the last 10 years, we've thought about quality and safety. But the prevailing paradigm for the next 40 years will, as this slide shows, be value. Better value healthcare. Now, the next slide shows that there is a move that's taken place. The quality and the productivity work we've done in the last decade has certainly improved value. But as you can see from these 3 columns, doing things right is only one aspect of maximising value. The other is doing the right things. So, to maximise value, we need to do the right things right. Now, the next slide shows that there are 2 meanings of the word value. There's a sort of moral meaning, like we value diversity, we value equality. And that is very widely used, usually in the plural. You know, the values of this organisation are, or the values expressed on our website say. But there's also a very commonly used economic meaning of the word value. And it's expressed in the ordinary phrase, in the shorter English dictionary, we cannot assume we get value for money. Value has become a hot topic in the last few years, and the next slide is a quote from Michael Porter. And Michael Porter describes value in this way. And as you can see, he talks about efficiency now being part of value. So value is the issue for the future. And this has big implications for you and your industry, and indeed for everyone in the health service. Now, what do we mean by value? This next slide is a simple formula. Value is the relationship between outcomes and costs. And outcomes equal good outcomes minus bad outcomes. So quality and safety are still important, because quality increases the likelihood of good outcomes and safety decreases the likelihood of bad outcomes. So they're still important, but it has to be related to costs. And costs are not expressed by money. Costs are expressed by the opportunity lost by things that you can't do. Now, value is obviously subjective, and this next slide shows that there are numerous different views of value. The patient's view, industry's view, the commissioner's view, and there's often a tension between these views. The first step in maximising value is to allocate resources, what's sometimes called to maximise allocative efficiency. And here's a distribution of expenditure of both cancer and cardiovascular by Primary Care Trust. And you can see here almost a 2-fold variation, and we haven't looked at this in detail. This is from the NHS Atlas of Variation, but you cannot believe that this is all due to need. These things have just happened over the years. The next stage, when the money is allocated, is to divide it among programme budgets. And here's an example of 3 programme budgets. Neurological disease, 4 billion, respiratory 5 billion, cancer about 7 billion. How much for mental health, you might ask? Just guess, looking at this. And the next slide shows that mental health is in fact £11 billion a year. And as the next slide shows, with the blue blob in the middle, there's lots of mental health expenditure in other specialties. This is just giving you an idea of what we mean by programme budgeting. And we will tell all commissioners that this is the way in which resources will be allocated in future. Now sometimes when we look at variation, it's pretty simple to see what's good and bad. The next slide is a picture from the NHS Atlas showing admission to stroke units. A low admission rate is bad, a high admission rate is good. But actually, the next slide shows a spectrum. It's not quite clear cut often what's good and high value and what's lower value. The next slide shows a classification of some of the types of lower value. Number 1, obviously, when something is clearly ineffective, but there's not much of that about. Number 2, and this is very relevant for you, we will be considering as lower value innovations that are being put into practice, but not in a research context that allows their value to be assessed accurately. We see, for example, a growth in hip arthroscopy, and that's competing for resources with hip replacement. But we don't see the hip arthroscopy being done in a way that would allow us to judge the value compared with hip replacement. And number 3 on this slide, always we're thinking of could more value be derived if resources were invested elsewhere. So here's a way to look at value in the next slide. So low value takes place when either high value interventions like hip replacement or stenting are offered with excessive cost, or interventions of lower value are actually offered. Now, what we've seen in the next slide is the changing balance of benefit and harm over time. As we've invested more money in healthcare, the costs and the relationship to benefits and harms change. The benefits flatten off. The law of diminishing returns. The harms continue to increase in direct proportion. So the balance of benefit to harm changes, and often you can see what Don Abadian called the point of optimality shown on the slide. Now let me show you how this will play out in future. The next slide shows a sort of traditional approach to getting more money for knee replacement. Namely, the providers ask the commissioners for more money that's either given or not given. In future, the commissioners will be looking at a graph like that shown on the next slide, which shows a 50-fold variation in cruciate ligament repair in different parts of the country. So what they'll do, as the next slide shows, is they might ask the orthopods, well, why not switch resources from other knee operations into knee replacement? Or, as the next slide shows, switch resources from some other part of musculoskeletal programme budget. Now, how will this be done? I've already said that there is an investment by programme budget. Within each programme budget, our plan is we have systems of care. And the next slide shows the new language of the 21st century, a language familiar to you from an engineering background. System, network, pathway. System, network, pathway. And here's an example of a system in the next slide. This is the thalassemia and sickle cell system. And here there's other new language which people need to learn. Objectives, criteria, outcomes, standards. And I'm now starting to run workshops where I'm banning the use of the words primary, secondary, acute, community. And I'm ensuring that we start to think of systems of care. And systems are delivered by, as the next slide shows, networks. And in a network, everyone's equal, including the patient. So what does this mean for you? It means that Within it, we need innovation. We absolutely need innovation. But in future, it won't be possible simply to demonstrate effectiveness or even cost effectiveness. You'll need to demonstrate how the value of the system can be improved by the innovation. What could be done less of? And there's plenty could be done less of. This book on systems summarises the lines I've been talking, and it also starts to move on to something I feel very strongly about, and that's carbon. I've here put up in the next slide another version of the formula, and as you can see here, I'm saying that costs equal carbon. Costs equal carbon. And when we look at carbon, we see that most of the carbon in the health service is not in fact heating and lighting. It's staff and patient travel, and as the next slide shows you, the procurement of drugs and equipment. Because inevitably you create carbon when you're developing and building healthcare equipment. So we're looking, as the next slide shows, at the concept of sustainable clinical practice. Every hospital, you see, already has a carbon budget, and it will need to reduce that carbon budget, and you will play a key part in that. My experience has been anyway that industry is 5 or 10 years ahead of the NHS in thinking about carbon. So, to finish, in the 20th century we asked what are the lifetime benefits of the technology, as this slide shows. In the 21st century we asked, well, how will this technology help this year? Here's another slide. The 20th century question was, is it cost effective? The 21st century question is, what is its added value and the opportunity cost? And finally, the 20th century question was, can our budget be increased? But as this slide shows you, the 21st century question is this of higher value than other interventions for this group of patients? So I'm sorry I can't be with you. I hope this has worked out well. I'm using simple, ubiquitous technology. I just finished with this slide here of the 3 overlapping circles. This is the third in healthcare revolution, and it's driven by citizens, knowledge and IT. It's the smartphone that will dominate healthcare in the 21st century. That is the revolutionary tool. Thank you very much.